On the night of March 23, 1945, something strange was happening along the western banks of the Rhine River. German observation posts peered through the darkness toward the Allied lines, their binoculars scanning for any sign of the massive assault they knew was coming. Artillery spotters in fortified positions along the eastern bank adjusted their rangefinders, preparing to call in fire on the American staging areas they had been watching for days. And they saw exactly what the Americans wanted them to see. Hundreds of tanks sat in formation near the city of Viersen, their silhouettes unmistakable against the moonlit landscape. Sherman tanks with their distinctive profiles lined the roads leading toward the river. Artillery pieces were positioned in firing configurations, their long barrels pointing toward German positions. Trucks rumbled through the night, their engines growling as they moved supplies toward what appeared to be a massive staging area for the river crossing that everyone knew was imminent. German artillery spotters called in coordinates. The first shells began falling on the American positions within minutes, explosions lighting up the darkness as the Wehrmacht tried desperately to destroy this armored force before it could cross the river. More shells followed. German batteries expended round after round, their precious ammunition arcing through the night sky toward the enemy tanks below. Fire missions continued throughout the darkness as German commanders sought to weaken the assault force before it could launch its attack. But every shell that fell on those tanks was wasted. Every round of precious German ammunition that struck those positions accomplished absolutely nothing, because the tanks were not real, they were made of rubber. They weighed 93 pounds instead of 33 tons, and the 1,100 American soldiers operating them were not a combat division at all. They were artists, actors, sound engineers, and radio operators pulling off one of the most audacious deceptions in military history. This is the story of Operation Viersen, the final and most elaborate mission of the Ghost Army. It is the story of how rubber tanks, recorded sound effects, and fake radio transmissions fooled the German High Command during the last desperate months of World War II. And it is the story of how this deception helped the United States Ninth Army cross the Rhine River with so few casualties that the commanding general could hardly believe the reports coming from the front lines. The men who pulled off this remarkable feat were sworn to secrecy for more than 50 years. Their story remained classified while other war heroes received recognition and acclaim. But their contribution to Allied victory deserves to be remembered alongside the more famous operations of the Second World War. The unit that accomplished this deception was officially designated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but the men who served in it simply called themselves the Ghost Army. They were activated on January 20th, 1944, at Camp Forest, Tennessee, and from the very beginning, they were unlike any other unit in the United States Army. While most soldiers trained with rifles and machine guns, these men practiced with paintbrushes and speakers. While infantry divisions drilled for combat, this unit rehearsed theatrical performances designed to fool the enemy. The idea for this deception unit came from two unlikely sources who recognized that modern warfare required more than just firepower. Ralph Ingersoll was a journalist who had worked at Time magazine and The New Yorker before the war, a man who understood the power of perception and narrative. Colonel Billy Harris was a career army officer who had studied British deception operations in North Africa, particularly the elaborate tricks used at the Battle of El Alamein in 1942. The British had deployed dummy tanks and fake supply dumps to fool Field Marshal Erwin Rommel about their true strength and intentions, contributing to a decisive Allied victory. Harris and Ingersoll became convinced that American forces needed their own dedicated deception unit, one that could simulate entire divisions and fool German intelligence about Allied strength and intentions. The army began recruiting men with unusual skills that traditional military planners might have dismissed as useless on the battlefield. They wanted artists who could paint convincing camouflage and design realistic dummy equipment. They wanted radio operators who could mimic the transmission styles of other units with perfect accuracy. They wanted sound engineers who understood acoustics and could create audio illusions. They wanted actors who could play convincing roles and spread disinformation. Recruiters visited art schools like the Pratt Institute and the Cooper Union, searching for men who could draw, paint, and think creatively. They recruited from advertising agencies and theatre companies. They sought out anyone who understood how to create illusions and manipulate perception. The result was a unit unlike any other in the military. The 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion in particular drew heavily from art schools, and army testing found its members had an average intelligence quotient of 119, among the highest of any unit in the service. These were not typical soldiers. They were illustrators, set designers, sound technicians, and radio enthusiasts who found themselves wearing army uniforms and preparing to go to war. Some had questioned whether their artistic skills would have any value in combat. They would soon discover that creativity could be as powerful as any weapon. When fully assembled, the Ghost Army consisted of 82 officers and just over 1,000 enlisted men, organized into 4 specialized companies that each handled a different aspect of deception. The 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion numbered 379 men and handled visual deception. These were the artists, the men who would inflate rubber tanks, paint fake unit markings, construct dummy artillery positions, and create the physical illusions that would fool German reconnaissance aircraft. Many had trained as painters and illustrators before the war. Now they applied their skills to fooling the enemy. The 32nd Signal Service Company Special had 145 men operating sonic deception, using powerful speakers mounted on half-track vehicles to broadcast recorded sounds of armored columns, artillery fire, and construction equipment. The sounds were designed to carry for miles, convincing German listening posts that massive military movements were underway. The Signal Company Special, formerly the 244th Signal Company, contained 296 men who ran spoof radio networks, transmitting fake orders and communications designed to be intercepted by German signals intelligence. Their job was to impersonate other units, so convincingly that German codebreakers would have no idea they were listening to actors rather than actual division commanders. Finally, the 406th Engineer Combat Company Special provided security and what the unit called atmosphere. This meant soldiers who would impersonate members of other units, wear fake patches and insignia, visit local cafes and bars, and loudly discuss their fictional unit's plans where German agents or sympathizers might overhear. They were actors playing roles in the most dangerous theater imaginable, where the audience was the enemy and the stakes were life and death. The technology they used was remarkable for its time, pushing the boundaries of what deception could accomplish on a modern battlefield. The signature piece of equipment was the inflatable M4 Sherman tank, designed by Fred Patton at the United States Rubber Company in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. Each rubber tank weighed only 93 pounds, light enough for 4 men to carry across a field, yet from the air it was virtually indistinguishable from a real 40-ton Sherman. The dummy measured 18 feet 4 inches long, 8 feet 3 inches wide, and 7 feet 9 inches tall to the turret top. Its proportions matched the real tank precisely, down to the angle of the gun barrel and the shape of the turret. It could be inflated in approximately 20 minutes, using a gasoline-powered air compressor. Manufacturing these inflatables was a major industrial effort involving multiple companies. Goodyear and the Scranton Lace Curtain Manufacturing Company joined the United States Rubber Company in producing them. Factory workers, many of them teenage women earning 49 cents per hour, called the products targets. They understood that these inflatable tanks would be placed where the enemy could see them, and hopefully waste ammunition attacking them. The irony was not lost on them. They were building weapons designed to be destroyed. The construction was ingenious. Each dummy was built on a skeleton of inflatable rubber tubes covered in neoprene skin painted to match the olive-drab color of real tanks. Metal framework gave the inflatables their shape and allowed them to hold their form even in moderate wind. From ground level at close range, they were obviously fake. But from the altitude at which German reconnaissance aircraft flew, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. Photographs taken from the air showed formations of Sherman tanks that looked absolutely genuine. The sonic deception equipment was equally innovative, representing cutting-edge audio technology adapted for military purposes. Engineers from Bell Telephone Laboratories had developed a system using massive speakers, weighing 500 pounds each, mounted on half-track vehicles. These speakers could project recorded sounds up to 15 miles, far enough to be heard by German listening posts across enemy lines. The recordings had been made at actual military installations, capturing the authentic sounds of tank columns on the move, bridge construction, artillery being positioned, truck convoys, unloading supplies, and infantry battalions marching. Played at the right volume and from the right location, These sounds created the unmistakable impression that a major military force was operating in the area. The half-tracks carrying the sonic equipment were wired with explosives for self-destruction if overrun by enemy forces. A 15-second fuse would be triggered by pulling a lever, giving the operators just enough time to escape before the classified technology was destroyed. The army was determined that this equipment would never fall into German hands. The radio deception was perhaps the most sophisticated element of all, requiring skills that seemed almost impossible to master. German signals intelligence had become highly skilled at identifying individual radio operators by their unique transmission styles, the distinctive rhythm and timing that operators call their fist. Just as every person has a unique handwriting, every radio operator has a slightly different way of tapping out Morse code. German listeners had catalogued the fists of operators throughout the Allied forces, using this information to track unit movements and identify commanders. The Ghost Army trained its radio operators to mimic the fists of operators in real units, a skill that was considered virtually impossible to master. They studied recordings of actual transmissions, practiced for hours until they could replicate the precise timing and rhythm of their targets, and then went on the air pretending to be someone else. When the Ghost Army took over communications for a division that was secretly moving elsewhere, German listeners heard what sounded like the same operators in the same locations, completely unaware that the real unit had slipped away in the night. Between D-Day and the final crossing of the Rhine, the Ghost Army conducted 21 to 22 large-scale deception operations across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. They suffered 3 men killed and approximately 30 wounded throughout the entire war, remarkably low casualties for a unit that operated near the front lines. But their impact on the battlefield was far greater than their small numbers would suggest. They tied down enemy forces, diverted artillery fire, and protected real units from attack by drawing enemy attention to phantom targets. By March of 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final phase, though fierce fighting remained. The Wehrmacht was crumbling on all fronts, but German soldiers continued to resist with desperate determination. In the east, Soviet forces were advancing toward Berlin, grinding through German defensive positions in some of the bloodiest fighting of the entire war. In the west, Allied armies had pushed through France and Belgium and reached the Rhine River, Germany's last major natural defensive barrier. Crossing this historic waterway would open the path directly into the German heartland, into the industrial Ruhr region that powered the Nazi war machine. The Rhine was no ordinary river. It was wide, fast-flowing, and overlooked by commanding terrain on the eastern bank. German forces had been fortifying the eastern shore for months, building defensive positions and preparing to make the Allies pay dearly for every foot of German soil they sought to capture. For centuries, the Rhine had been Germany's natural moat, protecting the nation from invasion from the west. Hitler was determined that it would serve that purpose one final time. The Rhine crossing was one of the most anticipated operations of the entire war, planned for months with meticulous attention to detail. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group had been preparing what they called Operation Plunder since before the Allies had even reached the river. It would be the largest opposed river crossing in history, involving approximately 1,284,000 men, more than 5,000 artillery pieces, and 29 divisions attacking across a front, stretching 22 to 25 miles. Nothing on this scale had ever been attempted against a defended river line. But the Germans knew the attack was coming. They could not know precisely when or where, but they understood that the Allies would have to cross the Rhine to end the war. They had positioned their remaining forces along the eastern bank, determined to make the crossing as costly as possible. The 1st Parachute Army, under General Alfred Schlemm, defended the sector where the crossing would take place. Though badly weakened by months of fighting, particularly in the brutal Battle of the Reichswald, where German paratroopers had fought with desperate courage, these troops were dug in and waiting. They knew the assault was imminent. They intended to make the Allies pay in blood for every foot of the river they crossed. The United States 9th Army held a stretch of the Rhine from the city of Wesel in the north to areas south of Krefeld in the south. 3 corps were positioned along this front, each responsible for a different sector. The 16th Corps held the northern sector near Rheinberg, just south of the British positions at Wesel. The 13th Corps held the central sector around the city of Viersen. The 19th Corps held the southern sector closer to Cologne. Military planners had studied the terrain carefully, and determined that the 16th Corps zone offered the best crossing terrain, with suitable riverbanks and good approaches on both sides of the water. This is where the main assault would take place. The decision was sound from a tactical perspective, but it created a significant problem. 2 veteran assault divisions were selected for the initial crossing, units that had proven themselves in combat across France and Germany. The 30th Infantry Division and the 79th Infantry Division were battle-hardened formations that had fought from the hedgerows of Normandy to the German border. Their experienced officers and veteran enlisted men were exactly what planners wanted for the dangerous initial assault across the river. But here was the problem. These divisions were currently positioned in the 13th and 19th Corps sectors, not in the 16th Corps zone where they would actually cross the Rhine. Moving them secretly without alerting German intelligence would be extremely difficult. German reconnaissance aircraft flew regular missions over Allied lines, photographing troop positions and supply concentrations. German signals intelligence monitored American radio traffic constantly, listening for any indication of upcoming operations. German agents and sympathizers in the local population reported troop movements to their handlers. Any significant movement of 2 full divisions would almost certainly be detected, alerting the Germans to the real location of the main assault. This is where the Ghost Army came in, tasked with their most ambitious mission of the entire war. Their assignment, designated Operation Viersen, was to create a massive deception that would mask the secret movement of these 2 assault divisions. While the real 30th and 79th Divisions moved north under cover of darkness to the 16th Corps sector, the Ghost Army would simulate both divisions in the 13th Corps zone around Viersen. The goal was to make the Germans believe that the main crossing would happen approximately 10 to 15 miles south of where it would actually occur, and that it would happen around April 1st, a full week after the real assault date of March 23rd and 24th. If the deception worked, German reserves would be positioned in the wrong locations, German artillery would be aimed at the wrong targets, German defensive planning would be based on faulty assumptions. The real assault divisions would cross the Rhine against defenders who were expecting the attack to come from somewhere else entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Merrick H. Truly, the Ghost Army's liaison officer attached to the 9th Army Operations Section, planned and coordinated the operation with meticulous attention to detail. It would be the most complex mission the unit had ever attempted, requiring all 4 of their deception methods operating simultaneously around the clock for nearly a week. Every element would have to work perfectly. A single slip could expose the entire deception and cost thousands of American lives. Operation Viersen began on March 18, 1945, 6 days before the actual river crossing. The Ghost Army moved into position in the 13th Corps zone and immediately began setting up their elaborate deception. More than 600 inflatable dummies were deployed across the operational area in positions that mimicked the staging areas of real assault divisions. These were not just tanks. The display included Sherman tanks of various configurations, trucks of multiple types, jeeps, artillery pieces ranging from field guns to heavy howitzers, anti-aircraft guns, including 64 rubber 40mm guns and 16 rubber 90mm guns, and even 5 inflatable L-5 liaison aircraft per simulated division. The aircraft display was so convincing that an actual pilot mistakenly attempted to land at the fake airfield, circling and lining up for approach before ground crews waved him off. The incident was both alarming and gratifying. If a trained American pilot could be fooled by the dummy aircraft from above, German reconnaissance crews flying at higher altitudes would have no chance of detecting the deception. The men of the 406th Engineer Company used bulldozers to carve realistic tank tracks around the inflatable vehicles. The treads cut into the earth looked exactly like the marks left by real 33-ton Shermans. Real artillery shell casings were scattered near the dummy guns, suggesting recent firing exercises. Fuel drums and supply crates were positioned near vehicle parks. Camouflage was applied to the positions, but deliberately imperfectly. The goal was not to hide the equipment completely, but to let German aerial reconnaissance discover what appeared to be a poorly concealed but very real armored force. This was the delicate art of deception. Hide things too well and the enemy sees nothing. Hide them imperfectly, and the enemy thinks they have discovered something they were not supposed to find. German intelligence officers reviewing reconnaissance photographs would feel clever for penetrating what appeared to be inadequate camouflage. They would never suspect that the entire display had been designed for them to discover. There was one cardinal rule that every man in the Ghost Army understood: never carry an inflatable tank across a road. The sight of two soldiers casually lifting a 40-ton tank would immediately expose the entire operation. The inflatables were always moved at night and always under strict operational security. During daylight hours, the dummies remained motionless, looking like tanks that had been positioned and would remain in place until the assault began. The sonic trucks went to work as soon as darkness fell each night. Half-tracks equipped with their massive 500-pound speakers rolled into position and began broadcasting recordings of bridge construction, heavy equipment movement, and armored vehicles maneuvering into position. The sounds carried across the quiet countryside toward German listening posts on the eastern bank of the Rhine, creating the unmistakable impression that major engineering work was underway in preparation for a river crossing. German sentries heard the rumble of tank engines, the clang of metal on metal, the shouts of work crews building pontoon bridges. All of it was recorded. All of it was fake. The spoof radio networks began transmitting fake traffic control communications, reporting massive vehicle movements into the 13th Corps sector. Operators mimicked the fists of radio men in the real 30th and 79th Divisions, sending routine messages that indicated both units were still in their original positions and preparing for operations in the 13th Corps zone. German signals intelligence, which had become heavily dependent on intercepted radio traffic after the Allies had destroyed most of their spy networks in Western Europe, picked up these transmissions and incorporated them into their assessment of Allied intentions. The intelligence picture German commanders were receiving showed exactly what the Ghost Army wanted them to see. The atmosphere teams spread throughout the area to complete the illusion. Officers wearing the insignia of the 30th and 79th Divisions made themselves visible at headquarters locations, driving around in vehicles marked with unit designations and attending coordination meetings. Soldiers wearing fake unit patches visited local establishments and talked openly about their units, dropping hints about upcoming operations while appearing to try to keep them secret. Phony divisional command posts were established and staffed with personnel who maintained the appearance of a fully functioning division headquarters. If German agents were watching, they would see exactly what they expected to see from a division preparing for a major assault. But the Ghost Army was not operating alone. The entire 9th Army participated in the deception, with activities coordinated to reinforce the false picture. In the 16th Corps zone, where the real crossing would take place, divisions moved only in total darkness with all artillery carefully camouflaged during daylight hours. No unusual activity was permitted when German reconnaissance aircraft might be overhead. Meanwhile, in the 13th Corps zone around the Ghost Army's positions, real artillery fire was stepped up significantly. Engineer parks openly paraded bridging equipment where aerial reconnaissance would photograph them. Infantry patrols were intensified to 50% above the levels in the 16th Corps sector, suggesting that this was where the main effort was focused. The 29th Tactical Air Command flew equal reconnaissance sorties over both zones, giving the Germans no indication which area was receiving more Allied attention. Army medical installations were positioned to suggest the attack would come from the 13th Corps area. Even real infantry battalions from the 84th and 102nd Infantry Divisions were attached to the Ghost Army's Phantom Divisions to add additional credibility. If German intelligence identified these real soldiers in the 13th Corps zone, it would reinforce the belief that major forces were concentrated there. The Germans took the bait almost immediately, responding exactly as the planners had hoped. On March 18th, the same day Operation Viersen began, German artillery started shelling the Ghost Army's positions. The first rounds screamed in just hours after the dummy tanks had been deployed. Shells rained down on the inflatable tanks, the dummy artillery, the fake command posts. The men of the Ghost Army hunkered down in their foxholes as explosions tore through their carefully constructed displays, dirt and debris raining down around them. Several of the rubber tanks were destroyed by direct hits, their neoprene skins shredded by shrapnel, but the men simply inflated new ones. Every shell that fell on their positions was a shell that would not fall on the real assault forces. Every round expended against rubber tanks was a round that would not be available when the actual crossing began. The Ghost Army was doing exactly what it was designed to do, absorbing enemy attention and resources while the real divisions prepared unmolested elsewhere. The Luftwaffe increased air activity over the 13th Corps zone, diverting precious reconnaissance assets toward the phantom targets. German fighters strafed the dummy positions, their machine gun bullets tearing through inflatable tanks. Bombers dropped their payloads on rubber equipment, wasting high explosives on targets that could be replaced in minutes. All of it was wasted effort, every bomb and bullet squandered on rubber and canvas, while the real assault divisions prepared in the 16th Corps sector to the north. Meanwhile, the real 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions were making their secret journey northward. Moving only at night, with headlights off and strict radio silence maintained, the two divisions slipped out of their positions and travelled north to the 16th Corps zone. It was a tense movement that required perfect coordination. Any discovery, any slip in security, could expose the entire deception and alert the Germans to the real location of the main assault. But the Ghost Army's work held. German intelligence remained focused on the 13th Corps sector, convinced that this was where the main assault would come. The German defenders facing the Allies were already in desperate condition by March 1945. General Alfred Schlemm, commanding the 1st Parachute Army, had been bled white in the weeks of fighting before the Rhine crossing. His 7th Parachute Division and 84th Infantry Division each numbered no more than 4,000 men, far below their authorized strength. Equipment was in short supply. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel for vehicles was scarce. The mighty Wehrmacht that had conquered France in 6 weeks was now a shadow of its former self. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had been dissolved in 1944 after multiple security failures and suspected treason at the highest levels. German spy networks in Western Europe had been effectively destroyed by Allied counterintelligence operations. Signals intelligence, intercepting Allied radio transmissions and analyzing communication patterns, had become the Wehrmacht's primary source of information about enemy movements and intentions. And signals intelligence was exactly what the Ghost Army was corrupting with their fake radio traffic. General Schlemm himself was wounded on March 21st, just days before the assault, depriving his forces of experienced leadership at the worst possible moment. His eventual successor, General Gunther Blumentritt, inherited a desperate situation. The front was incomplete. There were no reserves. Artillery was weak. Air support was non-existent. Tanks were few. The German forces along the Rhine were shells of units, brave men fighting without adequate resources against an enemy with overwhelming material superiority. At the highest levels, German commanders were shuffling positions in the final chaotic weeks of the war. Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz commanded Army Group H, defending the Netherlands and northwestern Germany. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring had replaced Gerd von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West only 2 weeks earlier, on March 10th. The constant changes in command disrupted planning and communication. Opposite the British sectors, General Feldmarschall Walter Model commanded Army Group B, defending the Ruhr industrial region. Model was one of Hitler's most capable defensive commanders, but even he could not stop what was coming. He would commit suicide on April 21st, rather than surrender his forces. The most compelling evidence that Operation Viersen succeeded came from German sources themselves, captured in the chaos of the collapsing front. The 79th Division's intelligence section captured a German order of battle overlay just before the assault began. This map showed exactly where German intelligence believed American divisions were positioned along the Rhine. The overlay placed the 79th Division precisely where the Ghost Army had staged it, in the 13th Corps zone. More significantly, the Germans had lost track of the 30th Division entirely. The real division had simply vanished from German intelligence assessments as it moved secretly to the 16th Corps sector. The deception had worked perfectly. The 9th Army Intelligence Section issued a formal assessment after the operation that left no doubt about its success. There is no doubt that Operation Viersen materially assisted in deceiving the enemy with regard to the real dispositions and intentions of this army. The 30th Division's intelligence officer confirmed that the attack came as a complete surprise to the enemy, with a consequent saving of American lives. German parachute divisions remained positioned opposite the 13th Corps deception zone, even after the real crossing began, wasting their defensive strength against phantom forces that did not exist. Colonel Harry Reeder, the Ghost Army's commanding officer throughout the war, later stated that this problem alone would have justified the activation of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. After 21 operations across the European theatre, Operation Viersen stood as the unit's masterpiece, the culmination of everything they had learned. The real assault, Operation Plunder, launched on the night of March 23, 1945. At 1800 hours, a massive artillery barrage opened from thousands of guns along the Allied line. The bombardment was one of the largest of the entire war, designed to suppress German defensive positions and destroy communications. The ground shook for miles around as shells of every caliber poured across the river into German positions. At 2100 hours, the 51st Highland Division made the first crossing at Rees, under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Brian Horrocks' 30th Corps. Scottish soldiers paddled across the dark water in assault boats, the current trying to sweep them downstream as they pulled toward the far shore. Machine gun fire crackled from the eastern bank, but the suppressive artillery had done its work. The defenders were stunned, their positions shattered. The Highlanders scrambled up the far bank to establish the first foothold on the eastern shore of the Rhine. At 0200 hours on March 24th, the main assault surged forward along the entire front. The 30th Infantry Division crossed north of Rheinberg, the men who had moved secretly from the 13th Corps sector now launching their attack from positions the Germans had not known they occupied. The 15th Scottish Division crossed between Wesel and Rees against light opposition. The 1st Commando Brigade stormed directly into the bomb-shattered ruins of Wesel itself, fighting room to room through the destroyed city. At 0300 hours, the 79th Infantry Division crossed southeast of Rheinberg. These were the soldiers whose positions the Ghost Army had simulated, the men German intelligence had confidently placed in the wrong location on their order of battle maps. They crossed the Rhine against defenders who were expecting them to be miles away. Resistance was sporadic and confused. German commanders had positioned their forces to meet an assault that was not coming, leaving the actual crossing sites undermanned. At 1000 hours, Operation Varsity began, adding airborne forces to the assault. This was the largest single-day airborne operation in history, with approximately 16,000 to 19,600 paratroopers and glider troops descending onto the eastern bank near the town of Hamminkeln. The United States 17th Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne Division dropped behind German lines to seize key terrain and prevent counterattacks against the bridgeheads. Transport aircraft filled the sky, wave after wave dropping troops and equipment onto German soil. The results in the 9th Army sector were stunning, exceeding even the most optimistic projections. The 30th and 79th Divisions, the same divisions the Ghost Army had made invisible to German intelligence, crossed the Rhine with an initial casualty count of only 31 to 41 men. This was an extraordinarily low figure for an opposed river crossing against a prepared defensive position. In World War I, similar operations had cost tens of thousands of lives. The Germans had been caught completely off balance, their reserves positioned in the wrong locations, their artillery firing at the wrong targets, their intelligence completely deceived. By contrast, Operation Varsity's airborne forces suffered approximately 2,600 casualties, despite dropping behind the initial German lines. Some historians have questioned whether the airborne assault was even necessary, given how weak the ground resistance proved to be at the crossing sites. The deception had been so successful that the elaborate airborne operation may have been overkill. The Germans were already defeated at the river before the paratroopers landed. Total Allied casualties across all of Operation Plunder were approximately 6,781, including 3,968 British and 2,813 American. Meanwhile, 16,000 German soldiers were captured in the initial operations, many of them too stunned and confused to offer effective resistance. Within a week, 30,000 German prisoners had been taken north of the Ruhr, the German defensive line completely shattered. Winston Churchill watched the crossing from Field Marshal Montgomery's headquarters, witnessing the assault that would break open Germany's final defensive barrier. On March 25th, he crossed to the eastern bank himself, spending 30 minutes in enemy territory. It was a moment of triumph for a leader who had witnessed so many dark days since the war began, from the evacuation at Dunkirk to the Blitz to the long years of fighting before victory finally came within sight. General George Patton, characteristically, had stolen headlines by crossing the Rhine a day earlier at Oppenheim with his Third Army. General Omar Bradley released the news of Patton's crossing at a moment calculated to take some of the luster from Montgomery's more elaborate operation. The rivalry between American and British commanders continued even in victory, each seeking credit for the breakthrough into Germany. The strategic impact of the Rhine crossing was immediate and devastating for Germany, accelerating the collapse of the Third Reich. On April 1, 1945, the United States First Army advancing from the Remagen bridgehead linked up with the Ninth Army advancing from the Plunder bridgehead at the town of Lippstadt. This juncture trapped Field Marshal Walter Model's entire Army Group B in the Ruhr Pocket, one of the largest encirclements in military history. 5 armies, 7 corps, 19 divisions, and 317,000 soldiers were surrounded with no hope of escape or relief. The Ninth Army's rapid, low-casualty crossing, enabled significantly by Operation Viersen, allowed it to pivot east quickly and form the northern arm of this encirclement. Had the crossing been fiercely contested, had the Germans properly identified where the assault would occur and positioned their forces accordingly, the Ruhr trap might never have closed in time. German reserves might have plugged the gap. Model might have withdrawn his forces before they could be surrounded. The 406th Engineer history concluded that the German failure to regroup properly after the crossing may well have been the deciding factor in making possible the Ruhr trap. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, recognized the disaster immediately. Writing in his diary on March 24, as reports of the successful crossing reached Berlin, he described the situation as having entered an extraordinarily critical, ostensibly almost deadly phase. The Third Reich had only weeks to live. The Rhine had been Germany's last hope for a defensive stalemate, and now that hope was gone. Model refused to surrender his Army Group B, even as the pocket collapsed around him, declaring that a field marshal does not become a prisoner. He dissolved his command on April 17th, releasing his youngest and oldest soldiers from their oaths so they could surrender without dishonor. 4 days later, on April 21st, Model walked into a forest near Duisburg and shot himself rather than face capture. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, just 6 weeks after the Ghost Army had deployed their rubber tanks along the banks of the Rhine. Historians estimate that the Ghost Army's operations across the entire war saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives. This is an approximation rather than a precise count, but it is a figure endorsed by military analysts and widely cited by the National World War II Museum and the Smithsonian Institution. A post-war army analyst concluded that rarely, if ever, has there been a group of such a few men which had so great an influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. But when the war ended, the men of the Ghost Army were ordered to say nothing about what they had done. Their operations remained classified for reasons of national security. A brief flurry of newspaper articles in August 1945 hinted at the existence of deception units, but the Pentagon quickly suppressed further reporting. The men who had risked their lives creating inflatable tanks and sonic illusions returned home and kept their secrets. They could not tell their families what they had done. They could not explain their service. They simply remained silent for decade after decade. For more than 50 years, the Ghost Army existed only in classified files and fading memories. Veterans could not explain to their families what they had done during the war, could not describe the strange unit they had served in, could not take credit for their contribution to victory. They could not write memoirs or give interviews. The extraordinary story of rubber tanks fooling the German army remained hidden, while other war stories became famous, and other veterans received recognition. The first public account appeared in April 1985, when Smithsonian Magazine published an article titled "A Phantom Division Played a Role in Germany's Defeat." The piece was illustrated by Arthur Shilstone, himself a Ghost Army veteran who had served in the 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion. Even then, the full story remained classified, and the article could only hint at the scope of the unit's operations. The definitive permanent declassification came in 1996, more than 50 years after the war ended. After half a century of secrecy, surviving veterans were finally free to tell their complete stories. What emerged was a remarkable tale of creativity, courage, and innovation, a story of artists who had gone to war and helped win it with imagination rather than firepower. The unit's public profile rose dramatically in 2013 when filmmaker Rick Beyer released a PBS documentary titled The Ghost Army. Narrated by Peter Coyote and featuring interviews with more than 19 surviving veterans, the film brought the story to millions of viewers who had never heard of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Bayer and illustrator Elizabeth Sales followed with a book, The Ghost Army of World War II, published by Princeton Architectural Press in 2015. It became a New York Times bestseller and was updated in 2023 with additional material. Recognition came slowly, but eventually arrived for the aging veterans who had waited so long. On February 1, 2022, President Biden signed the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act into law after a 7-year campaign led by Rick Bayer and the Ghost Army Legacy Project. The effort had been championed in Congress by Senator Ed Markey, Senator Susan Collins, Representative Annie Kuster, and Representative Chris Stewart. The ceremony took place on March 21, 2024, in Emancipation Hall at the United States Capitol. 3 of the 7 known surviving veterans attended to receive the honor they had earned 8 decades earlier. Bernard Bluestein was 100 years old. Seymour Nussenbaum was also 100. John Christman was 99. These men, who had kept their secret for decades, finally received formal recognition for their extraordinary service. The 3-inch gold medal was presented to the Smithsonian Institution for permanent display. The Ghost Army's roster reads like a directory of post-war American art and design. Bill Blass, who built inflatable tanks in 1944, went on to build a fashion empire that made him one of the most famous designers in the world. Ellsworth Kelly became one of the most important minimalist painters of the 20th century, his work hanging in major museums around the globe. Art Kane became the photographer behind the legendary 1958 portrait, A Great Day in Harlem, showing 57 jazz musicians gathered on a Harlem street. Arthur Singer became a renowned wildlife artist whose work appeared in field guides and nature publications for decades. Victor Dowd went on to work with Stan Lee at Marvel Comics. None of them could speak publicly about their wartime service until the declassification in 1996. Operation Viersen stands as the Ghost Army's finest achievement, the culmination of everything they had learned across 21 previous missions. 600 rubber tanks, a handful of sonic trucks, and a network of fake radio transmissions convinced the German High Command that the main assault would come from a location 10 miles south of where it actually occurred. That deception allowed the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions to cross the Rhine virtually unopposed, with casualties so low they seemed impossible. The Rhine crossing that Operation Viersen enabled broke open Germany's last defensive barrier and led directly to the encirclement of 317,000 German soldiers in the Ruhr Pocket. It accelerated the collapse of the Third Reich and shortened the war by weeks or months. All of this was accomplished by men carrying 93-pound rubber tanks that 4 soldiers could lift, creating an illusion so convincing that the Germans wasted precious artillery shells and aircraft bombs on targets that did not exist. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops understood that creativity could be as powerful as any weapon. They went to war with paintbrushes and speakers and rubber tanks, and they helped defeat one of the most powerful military machines in history. Their achievement deserves to be remembered not as a curious footnote to World War II, but as one of the most innovative and successful military operations ever conducted. Today, fewer than a handful of Ghost Army veterans remain alive. The men who created rubber tanks and sonic illusions, who fooled German intelligence and helped American soldiers cross the Rhine, are passing from living memory into history. Their story survives in documents held at the National Archives, in photographs that capture inflatable tanks and sonic trucks, and in the testimonies they recorded after declassification finally allowed them to speak. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans created a traveling exhibition titled Ghost Army, the Combat Con Artists of World War II, which has toured venues across the country since 2020. Historical markers now stand at Bettembourg in Luxembourg and Plabennec in France, sites where the unit conducted operations. The Ghost Army Legacy Project maintains an extensive archive of oral histories and veteran papers, preserving the memories of these remarkable soldiers for future generations. When historians count the factors that led to Allied victory in Europe, they should include the artists and actors and radio operators who made the impossible seem possible, who created an army out of rubber and sound, and convinced the enemy it was real. The Ghost Army proved that sometimes the best weapon is not a bullet or a bomb, but an idea executed with creativity, courage, and flawless precision.